I call the Honourable Member Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise and on behalf of the Labour opposition be the first to speak on the Social Security Amendment Bill number 3 at its first reading. To state for the record up front, Mr Speaker, Labour will be supporting this bill because, as the Minister has set out, predominantly it does make some what appears to be on the surface some minor technical amendments, but as the Social Services Select Committee has found in the past, with amendments to our social security system, that from time to time these minor amendments do have unintended consequences, and it is incumbent on the Select Committee process that we scrutinise these bills closely to identify where those unintended consequences might be. So I may not be in the position at this point, Mr Speaker, to raise some of those, having not had the ability to look more closely at this bill and question officials in particular, but I do give assurances to the House that that process will happen in due course, as it has with the arrangements we're currently looking at around superannuation, living alone payment rates that are currently before the Select Committee. As the Minister has pointed out, this bill primarily amends 3 aspects of the Social Security Act. The first, to require for weekly compensation and payments paid under the Accident Compensation Act 2001 be deducted dollar for dollar from benefit payments, applies equally to weekly compensation paid by ACC, an accredited employer, or in a person acting on behalf of ACC or accredited employment. So that one sounds reasonable on the face of it. Secondly, to allow backdating of an application for a benefit when payments have been made by ACC and the applicant's claim for weekly compensation subsequently fails. Backdating provisions are something that tend to be controversial sometimes, particularly for obviously applicants, and it is always, in my mind, appropriate for us to err on the side of caution from the perspective of the applicant to ensure that they are not found left short if backdating provisions are unfair. And thirdly, to clarify the provisions that exclude students who are eligible for assistance under the Student Allowances Regulations 1998 from receiving the accommodation supplement. Now, my question to the Minister, and obviously this would be more appropriate for committee stages, but I guess I feel it fair to forewarn her that at Select Committee I'm going to be very interested to try and ascertain what does that mean in monetary value? For students to go to the extent of cancelling particular student allowance arrangements in order to receive the accommodation supplement, for me that points to 2 things. One, that there obviously must be a significant financial difference between those 2 rates of eligibility, but secondly, the accommodation supplement, these supplements are never designed to be overly generous, but to ensure that an individual is able to survive. And for it to be, for the accommodation supplement to be disproportionately larger than what a student is subsisting on, to me says that there might be an issue with the student allowance rate that student might be receiving. Something I'd be happy to debate at Select Committee, and I'm sure we will with vigour. But I also want to point out, I'm glad that the Chair of the Select Committee is here to hear me give big props to all of the work that the Select Committee is going to do on this bill. I might be overstating my enthusiasm at this point, or perhaps not. We'll wait and see. But the Minister did point out in her address that she saw this bill as primarily being about fairness. I'm glad she raised that word. It's one of Labour's favourite words at present, particularly when it comes to the cost of living, which in many ways this bill really does go to the heart of, with the issue that I just addressed around students in particular. I would be happy for any member of the government to tell me what is currently fair about what students in this country are facing. Not only do we have a situation where the government is ensuring that by in real terms allowing a shrinking of the caps that are being funded in tertiary institutions, that students who reach eligibility for our tertiary institutions are being either turned away or being subsidised by the institutions who do not wish, in a recession, in good conscience, to turn away young people who have met the threshold test to enter into their institutions. That, for me, is an absolute shame. When we look at what Australia is doing to try and match what's happening in the recession, it is opening its doors. It is ensuring that its tertiary institutions are well funded and well placed in a time of recession to place young people who cannot find work into credible training institutions to make sure that they are upskilled and ready for when the recession turns around. And what are we doing? The absolute opposite. I have heard of institutions that are turning away up to 300 students at a time. And to what? An unemployment rate that's almost 1 in 4 for 15 to 19-year-olds. What is fair about that? What is fair also about a situation where students are cancelling their student allowance, which is relevant to this bill, cancelling their student allowance in order to try and get the accommodation supplement? Is it triggered, for instance, by the fact that they are facing such a dramatic increase in the cost of living of around 4.8% that many of them are struggling to survive? Match that with the fact that part-time job availability is decreasing and you have a recipe for disaster. The student allowance scheme is not built to allow people to survive solely on what we provide them from the state. They need part-time work. They need to be able to supplement what allowances they may be eligible for. And I really want to underline the may be eligible for, given they're all being means tested against their parents' income to the age of 24. And it is absolutely ridiculous that we determine that students are dependent until that age when, of course, very few of them are living at home or have parents who are able to support them at that point anyway. And they quite possibly may be married with children, but is still means tested against their parents, which is absolutely ridiculous. What is fair about a GST increase that hits the hardest those with the least discretionary income, and that does include students. That does include people who are trying to survive on ACC payments through no fault of their own. What is fair about that? And just to throw it all into the mix, what is fair about the government's VSM bill? And I say the government because they are supporting the ACT Party bill, and that is one of the small ways that young people in university and tertiary institutions are able to access health centres that are either at a reasonable cost or free of charge. They did, of course, at one point have the opportunity of accessing youth health centres, but the government's also let a couple of those collapse as well, just for good measure. So there is absolutely nothing fair about any of those things that those young people are facing, all of which are touched on in some form or another by the Social Security Amendment Bill number 3. I'm also interested by which is unusual for a government bill these days, quite a hefty regulatory impact statement, which almost seems to be potentially longer than what the bill might be. But under that regulatory impact statement, I was interested in point number 5, which is assistance for students is designed in the context that benefits from tertiary study accrue to both the student and the nation. So it is reasonable to expect students to contribute to their own study costs. I haven't at any point argued with that, but I do think it's interesting that we've got a regulatory impact statement arguing that there is a public good to tertiary study. That's something that you'd be hard-pressed to get the government to acknowledge. In fact, all of their policy towards students has pointed squarely to a firm view that there is only a private good involved in education past the point of when you leave as a secondary student. Because not even night classes are now viewed as a public good by the government, unless, of course, you're learning literacy and numeracy. And I mean that in the narrowest sense of the term, because literacy and numeracy cannot be learnt in any other form other than reading, writing and arithmetic if you are a member of the government. We, of course, take a much different view to the notion of education, of the notion of its contribution to society and the public good that it is, and we believe it should be invested in every step of the way. So there are many elements of this bill that I would like to have a wider debate. I'm sure my colleagues will pick up on the fairness theme around ACC, because there's a lot to be discussed under that heading, and I'm sure my colleagues will carry that theme through.
I call Katrina Shanks.
Mr. Speaker, I didn't realise we were in a